Today I'd like you to turn to the one-sample hypothesis tests with means. So please open up your study guides to this section. Now let's begin with an example. A government agency has received numerous complaints that a particular restaurant has been selling underweight hamburgers. The restaurant advertises that its patties are a quarter pound. Now how can I tell if they are really underweight? Well, to do that, we need to take a sample of the population and find that X bar value. But how do I know if this X bar is the one that I expect to happen, or is it an X bar value that's unlikely to happen? A hypothesis test will help us decide. So in hypothesis testing, we're going to try to look at claims made about populations and then sample data and sample it appropriately to make a decision whether we can believe that claim or whether there's enough evidence to refute that claim. So what are hypothesis tests? Hypothesis tests are basically calculations that tell us if a value occurs by random chance or not. They are calculations that tell us if the sample results are statistically significant. Is it a random occurrence due to variation? Is it a biased occurrence due to some other reason? So a hypothesis will tell us, once we sample data, whether the value that we got is common or whether it's not common. And if it's not common, we're going to call that statistically significant. So if our X bar value seems unusual, we might claim it to be statistically significant. And the probability that we actually sampled and got this X bar value that was extreme by chance alone is going to be very, very low. Now let's talk about the nature of a hypothesis test. The first thing we do in a hypothesis test is we first begin by supposing the effect is not present. Next, we're going to see if data provides enough evidence against the supposition. So if a claim is made, we're going to assume that that claim is true for the time being. We're going to try to sample enough data to see if we have enough evidence against that claim. Now, how does a hypothesis test work? The hypothesis test works just like a murder trial. How does a murder trial work? Well, in a murder trial, we always first assume that the person being tried is innocent. Then we must provide sufficient evidence beyond a reasonable doubt to be able to prove that individual guilty. So once again, a hypothesis test works the very same way that a murder trial works. We always assume in the murder trial that the person being tried is innocent. Then we try to gather enough evidence. And if we have enough evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, we can prove that the individual is not innocent. In other words, they're guilty. Hypothesis tests use this very same process. Now let's take a look at the steps for hypothesis tests. We first begin with conditions. Once again, we begin by taking an SRS of the population data. Now, if it's not stated, we're going to assume that if the sampling was appropriate, that we have a simple random sample of our data. Once we take an SRS of the population data, the next thing we want to do is we want to list the hypothesis statements and define the parameters and context of the problem. After the hypothesis statement, we're going to focus on the calculations. We're going to calculate the test statistic value based on our sample data, and then the corresponding p-values associated with that test statistic value. Then after the calculations, we state our conclusion. We always state the conclusion in context of the specific problem. So once again, we have conditions, hypothesis statement, calculations, and conclusion. Notice these steps are the same as the steps for a confidence interval construction. We did, however, add the second step, which is the hypothesis statement, which we will address in this lesson. So once again, we have conditions, hypothesis statement, calculations, and conclusions. Now let's begin by talking about conditions for inference for hypothesis tests. There are three conditions required